I'm going to start this with a caveat, which is to say that I have been in school since I was 3 years old, and now I'm a professor. So I've never had a job in industry or in any kind of corporate environment or even an internship. So really, I can't help with that side of things at all. But I, think that there's a lot of lessons that can be learned about innovation and advocating for diversity with different audiences and in different places. So I will talk to you about a bunch of stories which maybe don't seem super relevant to the sort of work that you do right now, but I'm hoping to sort of reduce it into some best practices that hopefully you can take into the different places that you all work in and the different people you interact with, and maybe it'll be relevant. And if not, it won't take too long, so you can have a snack right after. Okay, so I, never lose an opportunity to share adorable baby pictures. So I do want to share a little personal history, partly because I think it's very easy to see people at a conference or to look at somebody's CV or highlight reel and just say, well, look at this person. They just aced every class forever, and they just went from one Ivy League university to another, and then eventually they become a professor at MIT, and that's how that happens. And I think that is how that happens sometimes, but it's maybe not always the most inclusive way to bring a lot of people from a lot of different histories into places like MIT and other elite spaces. So I want to share a little bit of my personal history just to talk about my path here, because I do think it's somewhat unusual, and some of the things that kind of helped me on this path. So I started off, I was born in India, I moved to Kenya when I was a baby. Most of my early memories are in Kenya, and I moved around a lot growing up. I've actually lived in Boston longer than I've lived anywhere else, because I've lived here for 4 years and 3 months. So not a super stable life. But the thing that was maybe the most stable in my life was my family. My mom, my dad, and my grandfather are all engineers, chemical, mechanical, civil. And they were all just a really great example of the sort of people who really look to their outside environment to, see what's going on, what are problems that I can see in my world, how do I solve it using some, tools that I have in my toolbox. They were always really focused on using engineering as ways to help and impact other people. So one example of that, and probably the earliest example in my life, was on the weekdays when we lived in Kenya, we lived in a pretty big city called Nairobi. It's the capital, and my life was maybe the life of pretty much every middle-class kid anywhere in the world, right? You go to school, you come home, you go to the grocery store, you ask for ice cream. Nothing exciting going on there. But on the weekends, I did have to have an experience that I think was very, very unique and very impactful in my life, which was that my parents, part of the reason they were in Kenya was that they were working for a company that was putting up communication towers in rural villages. And you can't leave a 4-year-old at home in Nairobi when you do that. So sometimes you just take them to villages with you on the weekends. So I would usually go with my parents, armed with a soccer ball. Just, I was told to share, and then my parents were doing the real work with the crew of engineers there, and I was hanging out with the kids and having a grand old time. So it was a really, really fun experience for me, because I got to see a lot of the world that a lot of people don't get to, but also a very impactful experience, because it was my first lesson that engineering innovation could really be used as a force for positive social change, right? You go somewhere over a weekend, you're putting something in there that's really connecting these villagers to the rest of the world, and there's a lasting impact. You're training people to keep that communication tower going, and you're also increasing their access to education. So a lot of people, I think, are maybe more rebellious and exciting as teenagers than I was. But I happened to just really like my parents and the kind of work they were doing. So when it came time to kind of pick a college major, I considered a lot of different things, but I think to me, engineering just seemed like a natural and obvious fit. And to be honest, I also really wanted to be an astronaut, and that seemed like the only path to get there. So I went to, I was thinking about how do I apply for college. I'd only lived in America for a few years at that point, and I had no idea how applying for college really worked here. But I happened to be at a sleepover at my friend's house, and I heard her sister say, Ivy League is a good thing. So I Googled what Ivy League was, applied to every single Ivy League school, and got into one. Cornell. So luckily for me, I got into college and that was a great thing. But the reason I tell this story and kind of why I'm going to walk through the timeline a little bit here is that for people like me, I think luck has really played an outsized role in our success. I don't want to deny that I have some sort of aptitude for science, and I think I'm a hard worker, and I try to be a decent human being. But there are many, many inflection points in my trajectory to being a professor at MIT that were entirely the consequence of luck, and that's okay. That sometimes just happens. Luck plays a role in everybody's life. But I do think that sometimes when it's too much, right, it makes you start thinking, what about all those other kids who maybe based on one thing or another thing were maybe just as smart as me, probably had the same kind of interests and excitement, but didn't get here in the end and maybe ended up in a much worse place. Then you start thinking maybe luck should not be the only catalyst, right, in all these situations. There should be other things that we can do as a society, as a community, to make sure that these great kids are not just ending up in one place or another place because, like, somebody tossed a coin. So other examples I will give about kind of this, luck mentality is, I would say, so I got to college, the only thing I knew was astronaut and engineering, so I enrolled in mechanical and aerospace engineering at Cornell. And I think if I'd had a little bit more exposure to a lot of different types of science and a lot of different types of scientists early on in life, I would have eventually figured out that there's actually a whole bunch of other things you can do with engineering, like having an impact in medicine, which I didn't know. And luck played a role here again, because I just couldn't get into the Intro to Aerospace Engineering class because I can't figure out technology. And my neighbor in a dorm said something about, well, this professor teaching Intro to Biomedical Engineering has a great British accent. And I was like, all right, I guess I'll go there. So I went there, and that was my first exposure to the fact that, even if you are too squeamish to cut people open, you can still, as an engineer, have a tremendous impact on medicine by doing things like making medical devices. So that really switched my career track and aspirations at Cornell, and I would have loved to go and do an internship at, some company that would teach me more about this world. But I was an international student, and also on a dependent visa on my dad's H-1B, so that means you can't do any internships. You can't earn any money. You can't do anything. So here I am sitting with a resume that has 0 things on it and kind of grades, to be perfectly honest. And I just had to take basically whatever job people would give me, any kind of unpaid situation where I would have something to write on this resume to say, look at me, I did things. So I learned, there was a lab of ornithology at Cornell, study of birds. So I learned a bunch of different bird calls and gave bird walking and listening tours to a bunch of children. I worked in a water purification project team in the Honduras. Very cool, very exciting, not at all related to what I wanted to do. And probably the most crazy thing I did was I spent an entire summer working in a biology lab for 0 money, so several hours a day, every day in a basement, where they were working on studying essentially, when people drink a lot, their skeletal muscle degenerates, and when they work out a lot, their skeletal muscle looks good. So what happens if you drink a lot and work out a lot? Can those 2 things be canceled? So this was a real research project at Cornell, and they just needed somebody to get a bunch of rats very drunk and put them on a treadmill and watch them for hours. So that was my job for an entire summer, and not the most inspiring thing ever, but it was the thing that made me realize, so I was watching a bunch of these rats, and some of them would get really chunky, and some of them would get really strong, and some of them were super disoriented all the time, shocking. And it made me realize that biological materials that were making up this rat, right? The actuator that it was using, the skeletal muscle that it was using, was adapting to a lot of different cues in its environment. And that ended up being the focus of the research I'm doing in my lab right now. So it all worked out. But eventually, that led me to research, which led me to a research fellowship at a local biotech startup that had spun out of Cornell. And when I was there, I realized that everybody that had a job that I wanted had a PhD. So I was like, I'm going to go. And I wanted to do that, but I didn't have any money, and I didn't know how to do anything. But thankfully, again, I ended up at a free event because there was pizza there, and I was hungry, and I hadn't planned ahead. And I heard somebody say that grad school is actually free, which, if if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have even thought to apply, right? I wouldn't even have thought to get a PhD because there was I just had nothing in my network that was telling me those things. Nobody I knew had a PhD. Nobody in my family had done that before. So I ended up, applying to a bunch of PhD programs. I only got into one, and it was a great one at the University of Illinois. And I ended up there, but I almost didn't end up there because turns out that when you turn 21, you get kicked off your parents' green card application and deported, and then you have to come back. And I got my green card about a couple months before getting into grad school, and then ended up getting a fellowship that was only eligible for green card holders. So again, all these things worked out, and it was great and wonderful, and I'm standing before you today, so obviously it's a nice experience. But it does make me wonder, do we really need to be relying on things like free pizza and somebody overhearing somebody at a sleepover to get kids like me to places like here? And how many kids are we missing out because maybe they weren't hungry that day? So that's kind of what I'm hoping to just quickly walk through today. And I want to say, 2017, I showed up to MIT for a job that I was too afraid to apply for, but my former PhD advisor had emailed Bob Langer. Bob Langer hired me, introduced me to Michael, been here ever since, and had a very good experience. So life has been good, apart from a pandemic job search, but that's for another time. So I will talk about, most of my focus has been on advocating for women in STEM because that is what I know. Gender is not the only aspect of diversity that is important to include. It is the thing that I think I have the most familiarity with, so I will talk about, but it's just something important to remember that there's many different aspects of diversity and they're gonna require different types of ways to improve the inclusivity of our environments. So I focus on women in STEM because there aren't that many of us. If you look at actually completion of bachelor's degrees, it's at or about 50% right now in STEM, especially at MIT, which is great considering my mom was the second woman in her university to get an engineering degree, so things are definitely getting better. But nationwide, it drops off. At MIT, it's about 50%. Other places, it's significantly less. I think it was about 25 when I was an undergrad and even fewer in mechanical engineering. In my PhD program, I think I was one of maybe 5% or so in my PhD class. And then as you get higher and higher, postdoc professor, that number just keeps dropping and dropping and dropping, and then all the way up to things like Nobel laureates, so people who have had an opportunity to establish labs, build and develop as scientists and innovators. That number just ends up being very small, right? And then people will look at that final number and be like, what's going on? I don't understand. And then you start saying, okay, well, we've lost a lot of these people along the way. And it's important to recognize that at different stages, we need different kinds of things to promote people and get them excited and keep them excited about STEM. And these things, they really impact people in very, very real ways. And one of the most real ways, which is research funding and money, the thing that we need people to survive on. And being at MIT, I think a lot of people respond really well to data. So I like to share a few aspects of examples where the data has really shown examples of implicit bias against women that can really impact their career. So for example, there's this great series of articles in The Lancet a couple years ago where they talked about a bunch of different studies surrounding women in science, including, I think, this one from the Hubble Space Telescope, where they had, before anonymous review, they were seeing this big disparity in the number of proposals that were funded from female PIs versus male PIs. And just to try it out, just to do an experiment, which I really like that they tried, they just made it an anonymous review process and essentially just removed that disparity, right? So already they're asking and answering the question, why is it? Is it because the women are maybe coming from worse schools because they were filtered out earlier in life and maybe they're not coming up with as good or as strong ideas or they don't have as much data, they're younger? Or is it just because there's implicit bias in the people who are reading the proposals? And in this particular case, it turned out that there was implicit bias and they were able to address it in this way. And there's other examples too of places, including at MIT, where this kind of data has really had an impact. So there's a beautiful documentary that I would really suggest everyone watch. It's a little bit long, so it's about 13 minutes, so I'm not going to show it here. But there's this great example of female professors at MIT a couple decades ago that essentially had to walk around their labs and other people's labs at night measuring stuff And then showing people, like, did you know you're actually giving us less lab space, which means we can have less equipment and less students and essentially be less productive. And also, people were getting paid less. So all of these things led to MIT admitting that there was discrimination against female professors, and now there isn't a pay disparity anymore, right? Which I really appreciate because I just bought a house, so thank you for that. So I am just going to talk about a few different things that I've done over the years that span a variety of different ages, and then I'll wrap up with just some quick takeaways from all these experiences. So starting at the very beginning, right? Right at the beginning, I think people will say, like, how do we get girls excited about science? And I kind of hate this question because I don't think you actually need to get girls excited about science. I think they already are. It's just a question of making sure you don't shut it down. So I just want to show this video because it's pretty short and incredibly adorable, about a PSA that I did with the government, encouraging girls in science. No, wait. Oh no, hold on. Dominator, you said, is the sound. Decimator.
It's also something else.
Um,
Yeah, we're just gonna have to mirror the screen.
okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Okay. Sorry.
Oh man,
Sorry about that.
I thought I had it. No, it's okay.
So close.
I think.
Well,
Oh.
we need to do something else first. Sorry.
Oh.
Just gonna do this.
It's worth it. I promise. She's very cute.
I'm gonna go to your sound here. There it is.
Is it
Yep.
sound?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right.
Decimator.
That's the one. Okay.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Wiley, and I'm on my way to New York to meet this really cool person. To the sets. Hair and makeup. She's a biomedical and mechanical engineer, and I can't wait to meet her. There's such big cameras and so many people.
Take one, common mark.
So I took a scan of a heart, turned it into a 3D model on this computer, and now we're gonna print that 3D model layer by layer from the bottom up.
That's really cool. What do you do in your field of work?
I'm a mechanical engineer, and so I build machines and robots that solve problems. And I use a lot of biological materials, like what we're made of, because when you cut your skin, you heal, right? When you exercise, you get stronger. And I think it would be really cool if we could make robots that could do things like that. So you can see the plastics being fed right there, and they're gonna heat it up.
Oh my god.
All right, let's watch it go. So this printer is a little bit different than what I use at work. If I heated up cells from your body, it would be bad for the cells. So we can't use that. But we can use the same idea of building layer by layer from the bottom up in a different way of turning liquids into solids.
What are you trying to have your robots do?
The thing that I would really like my biobots to do is to integrate with our bodies in some way. So like implants that can sense what's going on with us, and if we're sick, they can do something to help us feel better.
What advice do you have for girls like me who are interested in STEM?
Think about a problem that you think is really important, because science is really challenging sometimes, and the thing that keeps you going is knowing that you're working towards something that matters to you. So here's a robot. It has two legs.
Yeah, I can really see them moving now.
Yeah, so this one's a little bit faster. I also exercised it. That sort of was the hypothesis that I was trying to answer, right? Like, can I make them stronger and move faster? And it turns out that you can.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh, it's developing.
Why do you think it's important to learn about STEM, particularly as a girl?
Each and every girl thinks differently and can make a contribution to STEM.
Yeah, a more diverse group can make a better and more creative solution. So we need very different kinds of people. Look at what we printed.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Wait, can I pick it up? That's crazy. She can STEM.
So can you. Learn more at She Can STEM. Hopefully the adorable was worth it. I like to show that for a couple different reasons, partially because 3D printing, Michael's right here, but also the really crazy part about that is that people, the first time I showed people that video, they were kind of like, oh, that kid's just like an actor, right? Like she probably doesn't even care about science that much. Like, it's just something that, people made her say. And the funny part was she was actually dumbing down how little she knew about science to be in that video. So I was telling her about different kinds of 3D printing, and I was like, sometimes we use something where we turn light into a solid, and she's like, oh, you mean like a UV curable resin? And I was like, yes, actually correct. She was not faking it. She just really loves this stuff. So that's great. So work's really awesome for a 10-year-old. But 10-year-olds, they're always changing, right? And the way they're accessing media and the way they're getting information about their environment is changing. So we can't always rely on national TV commercials to help get them there. Though that one was actually reposted by Carly Kloss. And if you don't know who that is, your daughters probably do. So check her out. So we decided, you actually have to reach girls in new ways. They're not always watching television and interacting with media in the same way we did. And luckily, I was part of a national ambassadorship program called the If Then program, as well as involved with a bunch of different initiatives at MIT Press that helped me reach girls in new ways. So one of the things that we did was we all had 3D scans taken of us, so me and 100 other women in science. They 3D printed us out of some orange plasticky situation. Made us confront how short we really are. And then printed life-size statues of us and have installed it in a park in Dallas, and it's sort of a moving art installation that's moving across America, partially to address the fact that there aren't actually a lot of women, statues of women that are highlighted around the world, so it's a great way of kind of showcasing that there are a lot of great scientists and real people that still exist, and showing girls, a variety of people that can do science. I'm also in a comic book featuring a bunch of folks at science in a place that is kind of a fictional MIT, and just shows girls who are very exciting, and rather than using superhero powers or using their scientific skills and intellect and curiosity to impact the world around them, they ask a lot of important and exciting questions. Also in trading cards and in museums. So even though I was not the most athletic person, these things happen. So it just, these are the sort of things where I think you have to get really, really creative, thinking about the sort of people you're trying to reach, where are they, realizing that they're all very different and are maybe going to accept and receive this information in new ways. And so we try out a whole bunch of different types of ways of acting and engaging this audience. So this works when kids are real cute and little and get along with everybody. And then they grow up and they become teenagers, and then it becomes a little bit harder to engage them, right? So then your tactics have to evolve as well. So one of the things that I like to do with some high school age girls is both at Cornell in Illinois and also at MIT, we have a whole bunch of programs where people essentially come to summer camp at MIT, young girls come to MIT, and they'll say, awesome, like I'm here to, I guess, learn engineering, and this is your chance, because if they have a good couple weeks that summer, then they're gonna be, hopefully, a STEM major in the fall, right, or a couple years later. So you can't mess this up. So this is an example of a summer camp also focused on 3D printing. That we did at the University of Illinois, where essentially it turns out that you can make a basically miniature 3D printer by taking a projector and using light-sensitive resins that turn from liquid to solid. So we had this little couple $100 setup of a projection-based 3D printing apparatus that I had built in the lab, made sort of a cheap version of it, and then essentially we were like, hey, there's this whole group of kids out in Kenya that I had met through different outreach activities that I was doing that were really interested in 3D printing and manufacturing and making these kinds of prototypes in their classroom and using it in their daily lives. And so we had this summer camp of kids at the University of Illinois, and I was like, make a really good 3D printer and we'll take it there and make sure that it doesn't break, because they're not gonna, how are they gonna fix it? They don't have those parts. They live in a rural village in Kenya. And so I have never seen girls just be more motivated to get a summer research project right? So they worked really, really hard, made some amazing different types of designs of 3D printers that were automated, would sync up with projector slides that were happening on the computer. And we ended up taking those to classrooms in Kenya, and hopefully they're being used to this day. So there's a lot of different kinds of cool, impactful, innovative activities that we've had and done with high schoolers. And then you get older and older. And as you get older, you have to keep adapting your techniques, right? So one thing that you'll notice with a lot of the outreach things that I talk about and I've done are that as I get a little bit older, I just look right behind me and I'm like, what is something that person might have needed at that point in time? So once I got to grad school, and I was like, okay, well, I've done this summer camp thing for getting kids from high school to college. So then the question is, how do you get them from college to be interested in research and basic science and innovation? So one of the things I did was essentially turn my PhD research project, which was making these little robots that were actuated by living materials, turning that into a class that we taught undergrad. So everybody could design and build their own robots. It's now being taught as a class at Illinois and at MIT, and also in MIT's independent activities period, where people get a month to try and learn something new. And some of the content of the class has also been translated into a book that's sort of at a high school, college level and above as well. So that worked out, and then eventually I started getting to the end of my PhD, and I was like, I would really, I knew at that point, sometimes when you're just really good at grad school, people are like, just keep doing this forever. So I didn't really consider too many paths outside of academia for myself. But I realized that I hadn't really had a chance to explore anything else. I had a little bit of a crisis, like maybe I should go into industry, or maybe I could do a billion other things with a PhD that nobody ever really told me about and I didn't know. So one thing that I did at the end of my PhD while having this crisis was start a conference that is now, I think, in its 7th year nationwide, called Women Empowered in STEM, where we essentially invited women with PhDs, different kinds of graduate degrees, to come and say all the different kinds of careers they could do. It's not just academia or industry. There were people there who were, the head of the Museum of Science organization in Boston and Chicago. We had folks there that, had just done a variety of things in entrepreneurship and law and tech, and really broadened out the kinds of potential careers and scopes that we could do. So this has been, I think, a really impactful way of showing women at the graduate level what they could do with their careers after, and not just feel kind of siloed, tracked into the one thing they heard about or somebody told them they were good at. And then the final thing that I've been doing since coming to MIT was, I was very lucky in that I worked on a very cool PhD research project where there are a lot of good videos and there was a lot of news coverage, and I would get invited to give talks and do these kinds of things all the time, and that was great. But I was realizing that these talks were part of the thing that was making my CV look so good, because people were like, look at her, isn't she just really an expert in her field? But it's hard to get that kind of visibility for most people, and especially for women, because of implicit bias, it's just harder for people to say, like, who do I think of as an expert in that field? Maybe I should ask that girl to come and give a talk. So one thing I thought might be helpful in this situation is just figuring that most people are actually pretty good, and they do actually want to be more inclusive, and maybe their circle just doesn't have that many women that are in certain fields. But if they did want to have women speak at their events or consult for their companies or help join their new venture or startup, maybe if they just had a resource to find those people, it would be a path or a step towards that goal. Right? So one thing that I started was called the Women in Innovation and STEM database at MIT, which the MIT Innovation Initiative that Michael runs has sort of taken on as an institutional resource. And essentially, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a database of women. It's a binder full of women. That's a dated joke, but that's okay. But essentially, it's a bunch of women, shows you all of their technical expertise, their expertise outside the lab, like maybe they're a glass blower, maybe they actually know a bunch of patent law because they went to law school once before, and helps you kind of just go through and find, like, for either the event that you're organizing or the company that you're starting, what is some expertise that you might have. And very recently, we actually got a grant from the AAAS to fund 20 women in our inaugural fellowship program. So we gave them a lot of speaker training on how to connect with audiences and share their stories and be impactful leaders in their field. They've all been placed in different sort of ventures to give talks, and I've gotten some really, really great feedback about the impact they've had. So, I understand that maybe not a lot of this might seem super applicable to your workplaces or environments, but I wanted to kind of dilute down what's the real takeaway from these things that are practices for diversity advocacy that are hopefully useful to you in your life. So like all innovation, innovation advocacy requires that you identify an unmet need, right? You see a problem, and you can't always diagnose the reason for that problem. So for example, with the Hubble Space Telescope thing, if they'd seen that after anonymous review, women were still not receiving grants at the same rate, they would know that the problem was not with the review system and the implicit bias themselves, but with something else, a feeder system into that track. So you have to identify, like, what is the problem and what is the real underlying reason for that problem? And then you get down, you have to essentially think about how do you adapt to the needs of each segment of your market, right? So now I know that I would treat a 10-year-old and getting them excited about science very differently from a 30-year-old who just completed her PhD and is thinking about what to do next. And the same thing, applies to every aspect of innovation, but certainly applies to diversity as well. The other thing I think that just helps, don't assume prior knowledge. There are people that don't know that Ivy League is a good thing, and everybody in this room has a ton of social capital. So I think, at the risk of maybe over-explaining things, like, don't always assume that people know the paths or all the different things they have available to them, and share the social capital that you have. I think that's one of the easiest things to do. The other thing to remember is that financial capital always matters. I did not choose my career all the time because I was super passionate about solid mechanics. I picked it because it was the thing that was most likely to keep me on a visa, right? So financial capital matters a lot, and this sort of thing is very important when you're thinking about, like, oh, maybe an unpaid internship is a great way to get somebody, access to a new space, when actually they might not take it because they need to work at McDonald's to help their family get by. So financial stability and capital really matters for a lot of segments of populations that are underrepresented. Things that I think we can all realize, identify where you're needed as a leader and where you're needed as an ally. So I know a lot about the challenges that face women in STEM because I am a woman in STEM and I've experienced some of them. I don't always know what somebody who might have a physical disability is experiencing in their environment. So that's a place where I can maybe listen and help people and support people through realizing what they need and get there, and realize that that's not necessarily my place to take the leadership role. And the other thing to remember is that allyship is good, but you don't have to be super passive about it, because that requires then that the person who is underrepresented is also doing all of the work to make sure that people like them are more represented, right? So one of the best pieces of advice I got from a female faculty member at MIT was to say, the best thing that you can do for women in science is to be a successful woman in science. So anytime that I feel like all of this other stuff that I'm doing is maybe detracting from, funding my lab or moving forward my career, I have to take a step back and say, I can't be a martyr to the cause all the time, because it's really important for me to be successful, because that is the best thing that I can do for my community, and just something to keep in mind. It's not always our role or the role of a person in a minority situation to be doing all of the hard work. And then the final thing is to just meet people where they are. 10-year-olds are shockingly on Instagram. So I realized that apparently I was posting a lot of Instagram pictures and not enough stories, and stories were where the youth were going to really form connections with young women in science, and I've formed a lot of really great and exciting social connections that way. And for you and your audiences, that might be in a very different place. So just kind of thinking, like, who is the person I want to reach and where are they? And if you're standing in a room where they're not there and screaming about how much you care about them, they're not going to hear, right? And I understand that it is kind of stressful. There are situations where I also just choose to opt out. I just turned 30, so I don't know how TikTok works, and I'm choosing not to learn. So that's okay also. But I think the end of the role is, like, just try something. I think advocating for diversity is like any other kind of innovation. Sometimes you fail. There are a lot of situations where we tried a new program or an organization or thing, and it just wasn't clicking with people, and that's fine. And eventually you have a few hits, and people run with it, and it has an impact. So I think, everybody, thank you for sitting through this. I think that shows that, you care about this, and maybe you're hoping to try something. So I think rather than being maybe afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing or doing something that's not the most impactful, the best thing you can do is just try something, and we all appreciate the good faith effort. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Well, that was great, and I want to thank you. That was really inspiring, and very timely for me to be here with you, because we've had a lot of women leaders in our corporations. We are MIT Corporate Relations. In fact, at our last conference, I had 3, one was a CIO, one was a chief digital officer, come up to me and say, what can you do here at MIT to support women entrepreneurs in the Boston community? And I was talking with Marina from IBM today, who's also a leader, So I'm going to convene a group, and I'm certainly going to invite you, Ritu, to see what we can do. So I'm very excited about that and excited about your work. And so when I was looking at one of your slides, it looked like, and maybe this is just the numbers of men, but it looks like women were, the STEM graduate or graduating population was what, 40 or 35%, but then when it came to the workforce, it dropped down to something like 20%.
Mm-hmm.
Is that truly that's truly happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what is happening? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some sort of hypotheses that it probably has something to do with the fact that women tend to take outsized roles in the home and in raising families, taking time off to have kids, or maybe not necessarily having social support systems that allow them to kind of keep going in one dimension and also keep going in other dimensions. And that's just really true and real. I mean, for me, you know, it's just like very personal. I won't try to share too much about my personal life, but I think there is a lot of pressure to go as quick as possible you can, right? Like you're racing through your 20s and you get the best possible job that you could get at the end of your postdoc. But it doesn't leave a ton of time for your personal life. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I'm 30, maybe I should have children, right? And like these are the sorts of things where it's not highlighted, it's not promoted, it's not something that people talk about, and it's a basic fact of biology that if I wanted to do it, you know, there's a certain window of time. So that's the sort of thing where I think, you know, it again varies. So in industry, it could be there are some things related to parental leave maybe that people could do to help expedite that situation, but I don't want to reduce it just to fertility as well, because there could be a whole bunch of other situations like women, you know, not necessarily being the first person that you're highlighting as a technical leader in your mind because of some implicit bias. So there's a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, we had that. Did you have a question, Michael?
Just to say that NIE, National Academy of Engineering, published a study quite a few years ago that looked at female graduates deciding to take a career outside of STEM, because and their hypothesis or conclusion was that they didn't like the environment that they would be faced with, and so
Yeah.
working but not in STEM.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point that came up in a discussion we were having the other day, is why is it always focus on the women? What do men need to do? What do we need to do as a culture to make those things not happen? I've been an engineer since the early 80s, and certainly, opted out of things for family reasons and other things, but very, very inspiring and wonderful talk, Ritu. I really enjoyed it. So.